Oh my God, we're back.
It is about time. It is spooky season.
No, it's not about time. That's a different movie. We're talking about A Nightmare on Elm Street. Get your shit together, Paul.
I guess I better go watch it then.
Have you never seen About Time?
No, I think Nightmare on Elm Street. We're covering Nightmare on Elm Street. I better go watch it because I watched It's
Oh,
About
that's
Time.
fair. I mean, I was gonna say because I don't feel like we're doing, like a Love Actually Richard Curtis style marathon that involves About Time, and honestly, not really in the mood to cry my eyes out either.
Yeah, I don't think that's something we have decided to branch out from horror recently. We had some talks about that, but I don't know if we'll ever get to that point. Like I love actually it doesn't seem like a marathon we'd probably do.
I mean,
Although you never
I would
know.
100% do it. I don't know about you, but
Well,
I would do it.
I don't know if I do it for a show. That's what I'm saying. I covered a
Oh,
show.
that's fair.
I'd watch it. Yeah, I have no problem watching
I,
it.
I want to smack my Apple TV every time I look because I have my digital library. Obviously, I've built it out. Physical media is where it's at, as you know, but like I still have a digital library. I use it for work. I use it for like you. I know that you have access to my stuff. Sorry in advance to everyone who's going to scream about people borrowing my login or whatever. Um, but it has About Time as a comedy. And in no world would I consider that movie like a full-fledged comedy.
Yeah.
Like comedy adjacent, sure, but I would definitely have that under drama before I'd have it under comedy. Like it is definitely a lot less funny than say The Boat That Rocked
Oh,
or yeah,
yeah.
yeah, or
I
Love
mean,
Actually.
there's some comic moments, sure. There's some like bit moments that are kind of fun, but like, yeah, as far as, but I would never even consider that to be a comedy. Like, genres are so weird, man. They like some people just
Yeah,
throw things in there and you're like, what are you talking
yeah, right.
about?
I feel that way all the time. It's so
Right.
bizarre. And it's one of those I feel like I'm on crazy pills when I see that stuff because I'm like, I don't what who was so drunk when they did this?
It's a great question. I mean, even drunk, I figure I wouldn't put it. I would make that kind of mistake. But hey, maybe I would. I don't know. Sometimes
I don't
I'm
know,
getting too
man.
drunk.
Like
So.
and that comes from the fact that of all the people in the world for us to like be upset about this stuff, it would be you and I because this was the kind of stuff we had to obsess over of categorization for the movie trivia show that we were involved in and all of that. Like it's just very funny to me because I immediately start going, that's not right.
Right?
Like that's 100% wrong. And even I find myself even doing that now. Like I have people at the bar when I do bar trivia who start asking me questions about going in like what do you consider horror? What do you consider like and I'm like
I hate those
if it
questions.
oh my god, it's I really thought I was away from that stuff until I did the horror trivia the other night and I had people being like, "Well, like animated horror, like Hotel Transylvania, would that count?" And I'm like, "Sure, it could.
Sure.
I'm not going to tell you whether I have anything about it or not. Like you're just fishing for answers at this point." But
Right.
like horror is a pretty broad thing. I can probably get away with it in this type of capacity. But
It's funny because like
dude,
horror can like be so many different things, but also it feels like it could be limiting because I think people wouldn't think about, well, it's funny, it's comedy, it's a kids, you can't have kids horror. Yes, you absolutely can have kids horror. It doesn't have to be like
Monster
a certain
Squad.
way. Absolutely, that's technically that's horror. Shaun of the Dead is horror. It's a
Well,
comedy
and I
horror.
mean,
It's
arguably, and I had this as a question actually, and it was funny because you and we talk. I send you everything that I still do because I always
right,
have you look over it.
right.
And you had brought up, I had written a question about Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein,
Yeah,
and not any of the teams at the bar got that one right. It was the only question that was a wash for everyone. But that is arguably like the OG horror comedy, and it came out in 1948. And
yeah.
it's not like a movie that is making fun of all that because it's actually Bela Lugosi. It's the only other time he played Dracula. Lon Chaney Jr. is in it. The guy who had been playing Frankenstein's monster to that point, that was not Boris Karloff, is playing the monster. Like all of those characters are in it. They're all involved, and it really takes them seriously
Yeah,
instead of
absolutely.
making them a joke. Like it's a great movie. It's an all-time movie in my opinion. I watch it all the time. I watch it several times a year. I fucking love that movie. But it's funny because you're right. It's a comedy for all intents and purposes, but it's still a horror film, and people don't think about it.
No, that's the thing. I think I warned you. I don't think the normies are gonna get that one. But yeah, it's all good. Eat some
Well, they
healthy.
learned a thing or two,
Hard.
right?
I'm sure they did. I forgot there was the other one. What was the other one I called you out on that I said was the Kevin Bacon one, Tremors. Did they get the Tremors one?
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah, people got tremors,
Good.
and I
Uh,
didn't change it.
good. I'm glad. I'm glad. I thought it maybe it might not get it, but hey, you never know because it's always hard to. That's where we had problems with
Dude,
Showdown. Times we ask like these questions, we're like, well, we know these things. Everybody must know these things, and like they didn't. But oh well.
well, that's neither here nor there. I like testing the bar patrons because they've been drinking. It's a lot more
That's
fun for
fair.
me.
That's fair.
Like, versus on the Schmodown, everyone was studying, so I had a lot less, I felt a lot less bad when people would miss things, and I know that that was a conversation we'd have behind the scenes where, we'd be told, "Hey, you guys have to, like, dial it back. You're being too mean," and it was like, yeah, but everyone's also studying, like, and they were making it no real secret that they were studying,
Right.
so pushing them always felt like it had to be a thing because it
Absolutely.
stopped being fun. Like, it was more they were taking it so serious, and so you're asking us to push you.
Right. We had champions like Sam Levine who were like not missing questions. So like, we had to like
Right.
get out there and get down and dirty and we had to try to cut you as the like be Drago and cut Rocky or be like Rocky and cut Drago, get him down a little bit. It's actually funny you mentioned that we were talking about movie trivia showdown as far as genre goes. Again, we talk about how we get upset about that. We used to get yelled at for making like
Uh-huh.
that movie's not of this, that movie's not of this. That movie's that. We're like, that's what we had to like make the decision. We're like, okay, does it say it on IMDb? Does it say it on Wikipedia? Then it counts. That's what we had. That was our,
Yeah.
our go-to at that point. Therefore, it's
That
black and
that
white, no
became
matter
our
what they
thing.
say. And that's always
That
accurate. But we had to have a somewhere to put our hat
It
on.
had to be some sort of barometer, and then it was like, "Well, that doesn't count as a movie." What do you mean that doesn't count as a movie? Just because you didn't see it doesn't make it not count also, because there was that whole thing where there was a question that you and I had written that just kinda sat for, like, the longest time in the document until they made us get rid of it, but there was one about a movie that Meg Ryan had directed that Tom Hanks was in, and it
Yeah.
was, like, officially the 4th movie that they had made together in some capacity, but because it was, like, a smaller indie movie, everyone was like, "Well, that can't count as a question. No one saw that movie." And it's like, you guys are all studying this stuff. If it exists, it should count as a thing. And it also kind of misses the point of like, there's something about the Schmodown that I think got lost in translation a lot of the time, whether people realize it or not. It's also used to teach people stuff. Like
Yeah.
it's a game show, and game shows inherently, when it comes to like something like this, like Jeopardy, you watch Jeopardy to hear answers and to learn things. Like that's kind of what the Schmodown is about being. And so you'd hear people complain all the time about, oh, some of these questions are so easy. And it's like it's easy to you because you get it. But then there it was like, even if we wrote stuff that was even like a smidge harder than that, people would be like, I can't believe you asked that. That's so hard. And it was like, is it though?
That's the thing too, is like we know you're studying. And like for that example, that question you're talking about, Tom Hanks was a slice on our wheel. We had a wheel slice, everybody had specific slices.
And Meg Ryan.
Meg Ryan, was she a slice also? I couldn't remember if she was. If she wasn't,
I
she
think
should
we
have
made
been.
her one at the end.
Then we might have. If she wasn't, that's actually one we probably missed. We should have probably had her, to be
Probably.
honest with you. But even if we didn't, it's Tom Hanks as a slice in the wheel. If you have an actor who is a slice in the wheel, you should know their filmography pretty well. And if it's a movie that stars Meg Ryan, like or directed by Meg Ryan, who's a famous collaborator, that's something you should know. At least
Yeah.
for the trivia contest. I'm not saying in real life. You don't have to know it in real life. I don't care. But for a
No,
trivia
right.
contest, absolutely. You absolutely have to.
100%. And it's so funny now because like I think about this all the time and how upset people got about it. And I think there's a world where you and I started having to section things off because we were having a lot of fun writing, and maybe we should have left the categories a little more broad than making them as pointed.
Right.
But at the same time, like I felt like we had so much fun with the pointed categories also, and the way that they evolved, that I thought that they played into the game just as well as like just doing broad categories.
Oh, I think the last season was our best as far as questions because we had those like fun categories. We'd have like collaborative categories. We had those like wild card categories, which were just fun one-offs and things. I think that
Yeah.
was our best season by far, to be honest with you. I wish we could have gone further because I think we were developing. We were still developing, I think, but we would have gotten even better over time. But it is what it is.
I mean, that's one of those things that I'll always dream of, and it's funny because I recently saw Kevin Smets, and
Nice.
while we were hanging out, for those who don't know, Kevin Smets was one of our like reigning champions in the show. He was part of the Inner Geekdom division. Like he was a big proponent for the show. He's a big personality on the show, and he and I have kept our friendship for a long time. obviously, since it ended and stuff. But we were at a wedding recently, and we were talking, and he immediately was in my ear about, like, man, I've been poking at it. I would love to buy the show outright now from Christian, and I've asked him about buying it, and all I need is like however much money and he'd sell it to me. And would you write for me if I did it? If I win the lottery, I'm buying it. And like immediately, I was like, Kevin, for you, number one, yes, anything. Number two, though, there's no world that you get your hands on this as much as you would love to.
Yeah, not the kind of money that they're talking about. I know that much for sure. But hey, lottery, you never know. And if I get enough money, maybe I'd help them out too. Because every once in a while,
I feel like $1.
It'd be fun. Every once in a while, I feel like it'd be fun to kind of get it together and do it again. But
I'd buy that for $1.
I'm sure you would. I would definitely buy it for $1.
But what sci-fi film is that from, Paul? What sci-fi film is that from? I'd buy that for $1.
That's a lot. It's a quote from a lot of movies, to be honest.
No. Specifically, I'd buy that for $1 is from a very specific sci-fi film from the 80s.
Which one are you talking about then?
RoboCop.
Oh, that's probably the most famous of it, probably. It used to be a commercial, a big commercial. Like I was thinking of the commercial from the 80s that had the same thing. It's like this one guy, he was this really, really crazy guy with that coffee. He's like, I buy $1. And it's like, that's what I always think of.
But I wonder if that was the point of it in the movie.
It might have been. It might have been like rip off of that. That might have been like, or not a rip off, like a homage to pop culture at the time. Yeah, that's pretty fun.
God, that first RoboCop. Oh wait, is RoboCop the 80s? The first one is, isn't it?
Yes, first one's in the 80s. At least first 87. The second one might be 90, I think. I want to say.
That's why I started to second guess myself. I was like, well, I know the third one's like 93, 94, so maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, the first one, I'm pretty sure it's 87. Movie release dates. Let's check it out. You never know.
Every once in a while, I land movie release dates like a boss, and then other times I'm like, I am the dumbest person who ever lived.
I usually get it within like a year or so. That's the
usually I can land it within like 2 years, but
RoboCop 1987.
Hey, boom. Look at that. You know what? It's so funny. So they announced, like, not to sidetrack us a bunch, but they announced that they're doing that TV show for it on Amazon, and James Wan is producing it. I'm hoping he's going to direct an episode or two. I think that he's the right choice for it. That's one that's always weird for me, though, because, like, I love the original, and I kind of like the second one. I don't think it's great. It's watchable. The third one's awful. The reboot is fine. It's a property that I have so much love for, and yet it's only because the original is so good. They've really never done a lot with it. And yet I think it's one that is so ripe for a legacy sequel in the right way. Yeah. But without Peter Weller, it also kind of muddies it for me because I kind of still want it to be Peter Weller.
Yeah, me too. And he's definitely getting a little long in the tooth. Oh, yeah. Something like that, potentially, especially for a robot kind of thing. So it's like, or a RoboCop, rather, kind of thing. But speaking of the 80s, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Jesus Christ, you couldn't even try. Like, you were like, I don't even want to worry about this conversation. Just screw you. Let's just talk about Nightmare. Like, that was the laziest segue you have ever made, and that's saying something.
You know what? I'm excited. This was my horror franchise growing up. So I've been waiting to do this for a while. So you can't help me. I'm chomping at the bit to talk about it, man. I got to rewatch Nightmare on Elm Street recently.
You have been bothering me for so long to do this franchise. And I say that as someone who's been bothering you to do Puppet Master.
That's true.
Knowing that I will never win. But you have been, for the last 3 years, ever since we started this, you kept being like, we have to do Nightmare on Elm Street. And I was like, do we? And you were like, well, we have to do Nightmare on Elm Street. And I was like, who says that though, really? Like, do we really have to? So here we are after no popular demand other than from the guy who runs the show other than me, that we're here talking about the 1984 classic, A Nightmare on Elm Street, because this fucker willed it into existence.
Well, to be fair and honest, let's be completely honest. When we began this podcast, we talked about things we're going to do, and one of the first things we said, we were going to do the big 3 horror icons.
No. You said. I said I was going to do Nightmare on Halloween and leave it.
Nightmare on Halloween, right? Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Or Halloween and Friday, you fuck. You know what I mean.
I knew we were going to do this from the get go. I always wanted to do these three, and then we could branch out from there. But I wanted to also, branch out. I didn't want to do them right in a row. We figured we'd do them for right for the spooky season, so to speak. I knew you weren't like Nightmare was third on your list. So I was happy to do Halloween and Friday first because, quite frankly, I love both those franchises as well. I love them as much as you do. I just happened to grow up with Nightmare, and that was my baby for a bit. And I will say, let's be honest, you watched it. We had a little bit of a conversation. We try not to have too much of a conversation when we watch. We kind of like throw some things out at each other.
It's true.
But we realize that this is, I will say, Nightmare on Elm Street is an iconic movie. We can talk about the franchise all you want. And there's questionable entries in the franchise. Hell,
I mean, like every long-running horror franchise.
Absolutely. I mean, hell, we're gonna get a questionable one next time. But this first one remains completely iconic and one of the most iconic. I think one of the most iconic films of all time. It definitely not.
I mean, that's not even an argument at this point. Like, I mean, here's the thing. I'm gonna joke about it a lot throughout all this, like, and he and ha about my feelings. Like, I don't love this franchise overall, like a lot of people, because I do think that there's weaker entries overall. But when this franchise is great, like this one, like New Nightmare and like Dream Warriors, it's some of my favorite horror cinema. It's just I was not as partial to it growing up as Halloween and as Friday because for whatever reason I just kind of gravitated towards like the very I mean, I'm going to call myself a basic bitch about it basically, but like the standard slasher fare.
Yeah.
Not that Nightmare's not, but like there's something about the more surreal nature of the franchise that it didn't quite speak to me as much growing up. Now as a giant stoner, in like how much I've evolved since then, I have embraced it a lot more. But like also to be totally honest, my stoned franchise of choice most of the time when it comes to anything is Phantasm. Like if you've listened to us long enough, you know that Phantasm is my go-to of all the like weird franchises to watch while you're stoned. That's the one. So
and rightfully so. It's definitely a stoner dream kind of movie. It is for
right.
honestly. It's funny that like I will say like this is lumped. When I say lumped in with the slasher, it is a slasher, but like Halloween inspired a lot of copycat type films. I mean, even Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of started that idea of a slasher.
Well, and so did Psycho,
Christmas,
1960.
Absolutely, Black Christmas, Bloody Christmas, Black Christmas, Psycho, and yeah, they started. Halloween kind of made a big hit in the '70s. Kind of like took everything and went with it, and that became like another benchmark. We kind of had a lot afterwards. And let's be honest now, having watched Friday the 13th recently, and despite our love for the saga, the original Friday the 13th was another kind of ripoff. And it took a while for that franchise really got going, to be completely honest with you. And if you take the first three, we're talking about our iconic movies of Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, and Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th Part 1 is definitely easily the least of the three.
Oh, so we were texting while I was rewatching this a little bit, and that was what I sent to you. I was like, I'm amazed sometimes how far Friday came as a franchise, considering the original is not that great versus Halloween and Nightmare, where you look at it and the first entries of both those movies are like legitimately iconic.
Banger.
And yet when it comes to Friday, I would argue it's not until Friday Part 4 that the franchise really becomes what the franchise is and like is iconic because of it,
Absolutely. And it immediately kind of stumbles into 5. Then it kind of hits big in 6 and 7, I think, too, as well. Especially as far as Jason goes. It just kind of felt like it was floundering for quite a while until it finally found its way. Well, Halloween hit hard. Nightmare also hit hard. And I think one of the reasons Nightmare hit hard to me was that it was different from a lot of the other slashers. We had the normal slashers. We've had some supernatural stuff. We had some supernatural horror. Poltergeist was around that time, 82. This had like with the idea that the slasher that could get you in your dreams meant you were never safe. And that was something that was very cool because you could always run away from you could run away from Michael Myers, you could run away from Jason, you could run away from almost anything. You can't run away from Freddy. he's in your dreams. That's a great iconic scary kind of feel.
100%. And it's funny because you look at it like, Wes Craven obviously didn't really want this to become a franchise. That is very like it is a very well-known fact that after this movie got big, of course the studio was like, we need to make more, and he's not involved in the second one. He did write the third one though.
Yes.
And then of course he directed the 7th one. So he did come back and like he was involved twice after the fact.
Right.
But he never really wanted this to be a franchise. He had written it as a one-off film. He shot it like a one-off film. And when you watch it, you really see it, to be honest, because that was the one takeaway that I really had from this one in particular. Like, this movie was not made to be more than it already was. And it
No.
really sets out to be a vibe film. And I was talking about that with you a little bit. It's interesting because I don't really think that this movie has like that great of a story. I don't really think it's doing a lot. Like, that's not a dig. This movie is great at doing a vibe
Yeah.
and being something that is just like overwhelmingly dreadful and scary. And it kind of comes down to the way it's shot. It comes down to the score. It's not necessarily that the story is that scary. It's that there's this overwhelming amount of dread the entire time, and that vibe pulls you through the movie because, to your point, the idea that are you awake? Are you asleep? You can't really get away from this guy. What's real? What's not? And it really plays on that. And it's almost funny how much I love Phantasm, and like now kind of rewatching this for the first time in so long, because I don't revisit these movies very frequently. How much of this movie is honestly kind of an homage to Phantasm also? Like, it definitely pulls from like the surreal aspects of what Don Casarelli was doing, but Wes is doing it his own way. And I
Right.
really appreciate that because it really makes the movie come to life in a very different way while still keeping like that weird dream like aesthetic that even Phantasm really for full bore goes into, right?
100%, 100%. Uh, I would love to say Wes Craven for sure. Like you mentioned Wes, and Wes is the real reason. He is involved with the you talk about the successes in this franchise. It's 1, it's 3, it's 7. Those are 3 e big episodes that
Yeah.
are probably regarded as the best, and they're all Wes Craven involved because Wes Craven is a singular filmmaker. He's a very talented filmmaker.
Yeah.
Gave us Scream eventually. He did Nightmare. He did Last House on the Left, which is actually got. I love his movies. He seems to like these movies that are about like suburbs and like normal
Yes.
suburbs and stuff happened. Last House on the Left, People Under the Stairs. I mean, like this is all kind of very cultural kind of things he goes into, but he does it in such a way that it's not like too preachy. It's not, but it's very vague. And you mentioned that he wanted this as a one off, or didn't at least didn't intend for it to be a franchise.
Right.
This had vague endings and stuff, and it's okay for a vibe ending kind of thing. It's why it's like, well, at the end, it doesn't really like what happened at the end. I don't really necessarily know. Is it a dream? Are we not dreaming? But you don't have to answer that question. Of course, it makes it kind of scary later on when we go back and try to continue it as a franchise. All of a sudden, people show up later and like, wait, what
Right.
happened? But you can't worry about that. You got to worry about making your movie, and he made the movie he wanted to make,
He did.
and it's
And it's
for it.
It is, and it's so funny too because the vague franchise ending thing and, like, doing that all 3 of the first movies in this franchise have that sort of ending.
Yeah,
That's the funniest thing to me because Halloween, Michael's body's no longer there. Was like, what really happened to it? Where did it go? Like, yes,
right,
it's the boogeyman. Was he human? Was he not? We never really get that answer in that movie.
right,
Friday the 13th, is it a dream? Is it not? Jason jumps out of the water and grabs the girl. Did that really happen? Did it not happen? Like, you know what I mean? And then this one, of course, is the Freddie, I take back your power. I never should have given you this power. Walks out the door. Oh, it's bright out. It's nice, but is it a dream? Is it not? Like,
mhm,
obviously, it probably is. Like, that
right,
one's arguably the most obvious of the answers. But
right.
even then, it still kind of leaves it like open ended
Okay.
enough that you don't know.
Right, exactly. That's the best part about Freddy, though, because you never quite know because it's a dream, and anything can happen in a dream. Like we have Jason, who is mostly real world. Well, I mean, besides coming back from the dead, as far as he's basically a
Several
zombie
times.
several times. But I mean, like in the beginning part, but like in the beginning, at like Friday the 13th Part 2 and Part 3, he is much more of like a normal, typical slasher kind of guy overall.
Right.
You know what I mean? He just has that kind of thing. Same with Michael Myers. He's pure evil, and Dr. Loomis tells him, but he's a kid that grew up and was crazy and came back. Freddy, you deal in a dream world. Anything can be real, and anything could be fake. You don't know what's real and not. And that's what makes it trippy. That's what's really trippy about it.
It totally is. And it's so funny because, you know, this movie ends up, of course, blowing the doors off of everything.
Mm,
And one of the things that's so interesting is like it does deal with Fred Krueger. Yeah, and by the way, Fred, not Freddy in this one, Fred. Like,
Yeah.
it's so funny when you rewatch it. He is never called Freddy Krueger.
Oh.
He is
I think
called Fred.
I think at one point Nancy might say Freddy, like taunting him, but the whole time
Yeah.
it is Fred Krueger the whole time as far as that goes. Yeah,
Like,
you're
he's
absolutely
even
right.
credited as Fred
Fred
Krueger
Krueger,
in the
and
opening
it's
credits.
the rhyme. It's the rhyme that does it to you. 1,
Yeah.
2, Freddy's coming from that's part. So he's Freddy, but you're right. For the most part, it is Fred Krueger.
Yeah, and so it's kind of fascinating that we only ever call him Freddy Krueger, and I think, like, to your point, I think it's, 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. Like, I
Right.
think the rhyme plays a huge part in it, but throughout the movie, they kinda just call him Fred Krueger.
Yeah.
It's this whole thing, and it's so different than what everyone knows the franchise to be
Yeah.
coming, and I'm so fascinated by it because you actually don't spend a ton of time dealing with his origin. Like, we get slight kind of ideas about what happened. The parents did murder him. They did take the glove, but we never like deep dive into it. And
Right.
this is kind of becomes a thing that even up to Freddy versus Jason is still kind of not fully dealt with until then.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
so interesting the way that that's laid out. And Freddy feels so different in this movie
Yes.
than
Yes.
all the others.
I was going to say that. Yeah, we talked about that as well. Robert Englund, who I love, Robert Englund, and he's the
Oh,
other.
dude, he can do
Obviously,
no wrong.
he is the other, magic part of this movie as far as that goes. Like, yeah, Wes Craven, but Robert Englund, he owns that role like nobody else. But you're right, he is not quite Freddy. It's actually very apt to be calling Fred Krueger because he's not quite Freddy Krueger until he gets to the sequels, really. He's not
Yeah.
the wisecracking guy or anything like that. But he is still very committed, very in like it's funny because I do a show on this channel called Review, and he is in that show. He was in V back in
Right.
1983 before Nightmare, and he plays Willie. And Willie is this bumbling, funny alien, like he's this lovable, goofy kind of thing. And it's so different from Freddy Krueger. It's so like a complete 180 from Freddy Krueger that it was hard for me because I loved V and I loved this
Yeah.
guy's Freddy Krueger. This guy is this slasher. But you mentioned the vagueness of it. That actually is what works to its favor. It's something that doesn't work, and we'll get there way back in the end. It doesn't work when we get to 2010 with the reboot. One of the
Nope.
biggest keys of that is that 2010 commits to this idea that Freddy's a child molester and a child murderer. In this movie, they always are vague enough to let it slide because you can't root for a child molester. You can kind of a child killer is more of a vague thing. So it's kind of a horror trope. You love Jason, you love Michael killing unsuspecting teens as part of that. Freddy's the same type of way. But if you ever once you cross that line and that gets out there, it becomes a lot less fun.
Oh,
And
100%.
that's a mistake
Well,
that they made.
it's so interesting you bring that up because this whole like conversation about children being murdered in film and all that has actually come to like a weird head
Mm,
lately. I don't for those who don't know what I'm talking about, it's so interesting because Terrifier
yeah,
3 recently came out. I'm not huge on the Terrifier movies. I appreciate what they are. They're not my version of horror and slasher. I think that they really lean in on like shock value to the for the sake of shock value, and that's fair. It's fine. Like people like that. I think art is like very cool in design, but I just don't gel with the movies. But there's a lot of talk because apparently there's something involving him murdering a bunch of children in
right,
Terrifier 3.
right.
And I'm not going to get into the spoilers of it really because I don't want to put that out there for people who are going to watch it in case you don't want to know. But there's an entire sequence in the movie involving him apparently killing a bunch of children, which led to this idea. There was people online being like, I can't believe they would do that. Like, how dare you kill children in horror movies? And I'm sitting there going, that's your
Huh?
takeaway from all this? Because we've been doing that in horror movies pretty
Forever.
much forever.
Yeah,
Like that is not the line in the sand that I'm about to draw. Like
right.
that is not the thing that would upset me in that. But it was just so interesting because yeah, people were really upset about it. But you could even point back to Nightmare on Elm Street where the basis of it is
He's
Freddy
a child murderer.
may have and probably did killed some kids.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, he killed that's why the parents ganged up on him at the end is because he had killed kids in the neighborhood. That was the big thing. He was a child killer, and that's what they got ticket. And he's now they're grown up, the ones who survived. I mean, that's the basis of the film. He's basically going after the kids that are left from Elm Street in that way. Nancy is a child of Elm Street who survived him at that point from back in the day. Now she's older,
Yeah.
but high school levels, and now he's just basically raised the age of the kids he's going after. But that is the basis. He's a child killer.
Well, it's so funny too because like then you look at it and this is neither here nor there with the movie, but in some capacity it's very funny because at one point there were two very different prequels being written. One was written by Robert Englund and one was written by John Saxon, and John Saxon's actually basically came out and said that it was the parents and they were wrong and Fred is like murdered wrongly, which is why he's doing all of that.
Right.
And so I thought that was so interesting that one of the people who wrote it, who is involved in this one, had this idea that Fred was actually innocent. And that changes that dynamic even more so, right? Because now it also becomes a revenge thing. Like
Right.
it's not just because they got away, it's because he was wrongfully murdered.
Right.
And eventually, I believe if the Freddy's origin episode basically in the Nightmare on Elm Street TV show was born out of that script that Robert Englund had an idea for. They took some of that and used it in the Nightmare on Elm Street TV show that they did.
Right.
So it's just kind of funny that eventually one of them did make it that far.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? If anybody deserves it, it's Robert Englund. He knows Freddy better than anybody. I think he develops Freddy better than anybody.
Well, there's a reason the character's so iconic, right? I mean, that's just the truth of the matter. And, I feel for anyone who ends up putting on the claws at this point because, Jackie Earle Haley, he's an incredible actor and he's a great choice for Fred Krueger. But the truth of the matter is that's just not a very good movie. And we'll get to that, obviously. But like, it's not a good movie. And that's not his fault.
No.
But it's going to be a hard shoes to fill no matter what, because unlike Michael and unlike Jason and a lot of these characters, Fred is born so much out of Robert Englund's performance.
Yeah.
And because of that, you're actually having to perform and you have to live up to a very different version of this character. Like Kane Hodder obviously is very well known as Jason, but you can argue that every version of Jason has its own
personality,
unique movements, and like it all makes Jason Jason, and there's people like different versions of Jason, right?
Yeah.
We've talked about that a bunch on here, obviously, while we were covering Friday.
Same with Michael Myers, to be honest with you.
Right, exactly. The same with Michael Myers, but with Fred Krueger, it is basically a singular performance outside of one. Down to the Goldbergs. Like the Goldbergs did their Nightmare on Elm Street episode, and it ended up being the last time that we will ever have Robert Englund playing Freddy on screen because he came back for it because they knew. And it was after they'd already had Jackie Earle Haley play the role. And it was like, we're doing a Nightmare on Elm Street episode and we want to have him on it. And so they did. And he's become iconic because of it. And that's considering, again, this first movie, his performance is wildly different. It's dark, it's mean, it's menacing. The voice is even a little different. Like it hasn't fully come into form yet, as it were.
It's funny that like this is probably the definitive Nightmare on Elm Street, but yet Freddy is not the definitive Freddy, and that's interesting comparison. Because you're right, his voice is deeper, it's more like seedy, and he starts like getting to 3, 4. He starts being a wisecracking villain. Where like even by the time 6 rolls around, which we'll get to, Freddy's dead, which I know you have a soft spot for. I get it. He's definitely much more.
I mean, it's only. You have to preface that with, I also know it's bad. It just was the first Nightmare movie I ever saw.
Right, and that's absolutely fine. But he's definitely less scary in Freddy's Dead because it's almost too wisecracky in a way. I like him right in the middle. Like I think Nightmare 3 was like the perfect Freddy, which we'll get to. I think I'll have to rewatch. When we watch it, I'll make the determination again. Because Wes Craven's New Nightmare is a totally different thing too. But this one is really hardcore. Deep, dark, just plays on fears. He's definitely insane. But you're right. It's such a singular performance. It's hard to imagine anybody in the role. It's hard. Like he mentioned, he would love to do like an animated Nightmare on Elm Street, and so he could still voice it. So he could still do that. I think that'd be great. Love to see that.
Dude, that'd be honestly so cool. that's the move sometimes. Like, I would love to see more animated versions of, some of these slashers.
Right, you get away with a lot in animation, and you do a lot of cool things you probably couldn't do in live action. So make it work, especially for Nightmare, especially for a dream
Yeah.
demon like that in a way. Absolutely, I think Robert Englund's also. I mean, he pushes a lot of weird ideas and strange ideas sometimes. I think he posited, if I remember correctly, Kevin Bacon as a possible like Freddy.
That's it's more a fan cast sort of thing that people have been saying that they'd like him to be the next
And he
Freddy.
said he liked it too. He liked the idea or something to
Yeah.
that effect. He'd commented on it. And Kevin Bacon would be great too, I think. But at the same time, it's not Robert Englund. To the point where like even Stranger Things happened. We had a nice little homage to
Yeah.
the Nightmare when he got to play a small part in that. It's so different than all the other slashers we've had because I can't think of any other slasher that really has that it's that definitively tied to an actor. I mean, because most slashers are
There's
irreplaceable.
the only one I'd argue, honestly, is, Norman Bates, and even then, like, you could make the argument that Freddie Highmore
Yeah,
became as iconic for a generation because he did the TV show, right?
yeah,
But because this one, like, I guess the only other one, maybe Anthony Hopkins, but once again, you run into, well, they also did a TV show and people really love, Mads Mikkelsen.
yeah. And you
So,
know what?
like,
I mean, people like Brian Cox from Manhunter as well.
right.
Yeah,
So, there's a lot of different people who've been played because again, Freddy's obviously been played by another actor, but we don't talk about that really. Like,
no,
you talk about Freddy, you're talking about Robert Englund
right.
very, very much.
Distinctively, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it all begins with this film. I will say,
Yeah.
I love the fact right from the get go, you get where this film is going because we open in that dirty boiler room. You see Freddie
Mhm.
making the glove. You hear Robert Englund laugh, and I have to tell you, you mentioned. I'm glad you did. I don't think this score gets nearly the credit it deserves.
No.
Like, you hear
Charles
Halloween always gets the
Bernstein
score,
understood it.
Friday the 13th Mancini gets the score, and you always hear about the and all that stuff that goes on. Yeah, but this Nightmare score is brilliant. It's the terror vibe, it's the uncomfortableness. He just gets it. It's just a droney kinda and it's like, "Oh,
Yeah.
this is so creepy." I love this score. It's one of my favorite horror scores of all time.
It's up there with the original Halloween for me.
Right, me too.
And it's I can't like that and obviously Psycho, right? Because the
Yep.
3 of those for me, when you look at horror movies and the importance of scores within film specifically, those 3 always come to mind because I
Mhm.
think for me, those 3 films are so deeply inundated with the choices that their composers make, whether it was John Carpenter obviously doing his own like thing, knowing what he was doing there when it came to Psycho and how they were looking at that. And this one, they all create a sense of dread that you're not really anticipating.
Right.
In a way that makes it that the entire time you're kind of on edge because the scores are a lot more ever present
Mm,
even when you're not realizing it. And when you start to realize it's ever present, it makes you more nervous. And I really like that because it creates mood, it creates atmosphere. Like you can do that with cinematography, you can do that with a lot of things. But when your music also leans on it, it becomes another thing entirely and it becomes more fun,
a
honestly. And
absolutely.
this movie really, really does a fantastic job with that.
And I'm gonna tell you, you think about it, I think scores in general can be underrated because the greatest horror films they all have that great score that can really kind of keep an underlying sense of tension that gets you involved in the film. You get engaged in the film because the score keeps you engaged. Even if you're
Right.
not watching it, you can like turn away for a second, especially in these days. You got your phone, you're on the couch, and there's phone, there's text and stuff, and then you get distracted. That score right there will just kind of keep you on the edge of your toes and keep you involved.
Yeah, 100%, and I think that it's so interesting because I had never really noticed just how ever present it was until I was watching it on this go around, and I was really, really fascinated by it. And again, I think that a lot of that comes from how much I also love Phantasm and really noticing so many of the similarities between the original Phantasm and and this original Nightmare on Elm Street Don Coscarelli's Phantasm movie really has like the same sort of like just melodic drone surreal soundscape
Yeah.
and score. And this one does it with like the heavy synth techno style, but it works because there's something also about in the 80s synth and techno like style music had become so much more popular again.
Oh, yeah.
And the way that because it was more relevant to that generation to use it and twist it is so fascinating because something that should make you like kind of excited, like, they still use that kind of music at clubs. People dance to that type of stuff.
Yeah.
And so you're taking that and twisting it and almost weaponizing it against people that something that should sound so fun and cheery now feels like a dagger in your heart. And I
Yeah.
love that. Like I think that it disarms you, it makes you uncomfortable, and it makes the entire movie feel different, and I really, really appreciate that.
Agreed. Fully agreed. Um, Now, I will say one thing that surprised me about this movie, as far because this is a movie I've seen many times, really. I've
Mhm.
loved it. It was one of my formative horror movies, one of the first ones I had seen when I was younger. And this film is chock full of like iconic horror imagery that lasts to this
Yep.
day. Like even more than like Halloween, and I would even say argue more than Halloween and Friday and things like that. Like, not saying it's a more iconic movie than Halloween, but there's certain like specific moments you're like that. I remember seeing this like pervasive. And I'm talking about like the Friday through the wall. I'm talking about
Mhm.
the body bag dragging across the thing. I'm talking about the bloody the Tina on the ceiling. I'm talking about the blood going through Johnny Depp's. These are like images that
Yeah.
really kind of just still. I'm like,
The
I just keep
phone,
going, wow,
the
iconic
tongue coming out of the phone.
tongue coming out of the phone. I kept going, boom, iconic, boom, iconic, boom. I think it's amazing how many shots that Craven made in this that last to this day.
No, 100%, and it's funny because you bring it up, it's like, I would argue that only Halloween rivals it, and even then, like, Halloween has a bunch of great iconic shots. There's things that you think about all the time. Michael in the doorway with the blanket over him, Michael from a distance hiding behind the bushes,
Right?
Michael behind Lori in the shadows. Like there's a lot of that stuff. Her behind the couch with the knife,
Yeah.
like all of that. Michael coming through the door. That
Yeah.
movie's got a bunch of them too. But I'd argue that Nightmare might honestly have more. I think that there was weirdly more impactful in some ways because this one followed Halloween. Horror movies were a
Right.
lot more accessible at that point in a lot of ways. They were starting to become more popular. And this franchise in particular ended up chasing a lot of that
Yeah.
because the movie ended up being so iconic that you're trying to find ways to top it or pay homage to what the original did. And so because of that, this movie ends up standing out even more
Yeah.
because Wes really like threw so much of himself into it in making something that you were going to remember,
Hmm.
and we do remember it. Like there's so much of it. Again, I mean, arguably Johnny Depp's death in this, I would say it's easy top 5 horror death of all time. If you know horror movies, you know exactly what you're talking. Like when someone goes the Johnny Depp death in A Nightmare on Elm Street, you immediately know what it means. You
Hmm.
you don't have to think about it. You don't have to look it up. If you love horror movies, you already know. And you
Absolutely.
may not even like horror movies and you might know
Yeah.
because it just became such a like pop culture thing.
And that's helped because Johnny Depp became a famous actor, obviously, throughout. That doesn't hurt. Much like Kevin Bacon's death on Friday the 13th is probably helped by
Right.
Kevin Bacon being known, for example. Halloween, like, for example, probably one of the most iconic Halloween death is probably Michael stabbing the guy through and, like, holding him up on
And this,
the
the
pantry or whatever,
looking in.
and the
Yep.
head. Right, exactly. I don't know the actor's name. I can't remember the actor's name. But that is one of those kind of shots that do last throughout. And it's kind of funny how Friday Nightmare has two blood in bedroom scenes that are so iconic. You have Johnny Depp's, and then you have the Tina when Tina's like getting thrown around the ceiling there,
Yeah.
and then she lands and like the blood splashes. It's like, oh, it's so good. It's such a good iconic
And I
scene.
gotta credit Wes with this too in a lot of ways. Tina being jockeyed up front as like our heroine,
Right.
only to have the rug pulled out from under us so quickly, is such a great trope. Obviously, originally done from Psycho, that was part of why they wanted to do it. Was once you do that, you flip the audience. And I think that Tina's such a sympathetic character. You really feel for her. Clearly, some stuff has been going on. Like, she's in a not the world's best relationship on top of it. Like, the dude's real skeezy, and yet, teenage love and all of that. But you feel for her. And so it almost feels unfair when she dies,
Yeah.
because it's like everything else is already so terrible. And then that on top of it. And you just kind of feel for her. And it makes the audience uncomfortable. And I have to say, this movie is 91 minutes front to back, basically.
Yeah.
And it doesn't waste any time. This movie moves so fast, so in your face, so just like clicks through. It never feels too long. It never outstays its welcome. Like, all of it just works. And in 90 minutes, you get so much
Right.
iconic stuff. You get so much fun in 90 minutes, and you get a lot of cool characters.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, there's not a lot happening here. Also, shout out Lin Shaye,
Lin
young
Shaye.
Lin Shaye, which is so odd and random in the best way. Hey, you're in the wrong horror franchise involving dream worlds, Lynn. Get back to Insidious, but that's fine. It's just funny, like, this movie, for being 90 minutes, it kind of changed Hollywood in a lot of ways. I feel like it kind of broke a mold again, and it was like, look at what we can do now. Like, we can do slasher stuff that's beyond slasher stuff. Like, this is a dream sequence now. Let's get weird. Let's get surreal. Like, push that, and they do.
Yeah. I mean, this is the New Line is the house that Freddie built, and that's why, because it was that successful, that powerful. New Line Cinema does not exist without Nightmare on Elm Street. It's also why they kept going back for more, despite Wes Craven's
Well,
desire.
and they're not wrong for doing it. You know what I'm
No,
saying?
I
Like,
don't know.
they're not, and I love them for it. I think that there's something uniquely special about Nightmare as a franchise, even though Wes is like a lot less involved with it moving forward, obviously, in the same way that Carpenter's really not involved with Halloween. But Nightmare does feel like it's also the house that Freddy built when it comes to New Line. You're right.
Mhm,
And so that becomes such an interesting thing,
mhm,
because to me, that it is so tied to the history of that company that it uniquely stands alone in literally building a studio, because Friday was just part of like Paramount.
yeah,
Paramount is there. They're just doing it because Halloween became successful. Halloween was not like a big studio film. It was an indie film like that. You know what I mean? There was no building of the ground from that. Like, Carpenter became more prolific because of it, but you wouldn't even then, like, most of his movies kind of bomb after that regardless.
yeah,
So it's a very weird thing where Nightmare, like, obviously Wes was already very talented and very popular and had done lots of stuff to that point. Like, The Hills Have Eyes has already happened. Last House on the Left has already
what happened?
happened. Wes has done his stuff. Uh, he still has much more to go. Like, he's just over a decade away from doing Scream at this point, and like, Scream also feels like such a direct response to a lot of how Nightmare happened and what like how popular horror became because of Nightmare and Halloween. But Nightmare becoming this like powerhouse thing, no other horror franchise had that. And because was so ingrained in this studio, they knew that they had to keep going back to it and taking care of it. And it's funny because you and I have talked about this on here before, where I kept being like, I really wish like Blumhouse would end up with it and they could do something with it, or anything. But I also have to remember, like, there's a reason that New Line really hasn't given it up. And that's really because it's still their baby. It's
Yeah,
still that, like, the part of them that built that studio. And so they're very weirdly protective of it in the right way, while also clearly not being protective enough of it when you look at like the remake.
yeah.
Um,
It does
so,
surprise me. It does surprise me that we haven't gotten any attempts since 2010 to do anything with it. It's such a bankable idea, such a bankable prospect. I know 2010 was not successful. It's been 14 years and they've
yeah,
done nothing with it. And I know part of that is the Robert Englund experience. I think part of it that probably made him gun shy. I don't. Maybe nobody else can do it, but Robert. Maybe that's what they took away from it. Of course, that's the
yeah,
wrong takeaway because Jackie Earl Haley was fine. He just wasn't given the material to work with as well.
right.
Um, but I understand the hesitation for sure. But it is that way. I mean, there's so much has been built from this film. You've met that, like, you got Nightmare, which really influenced most other horrors. Wes Craven's New Nightmare is a direct descendant and also a direct ancestor of Scream. There's no Scream without Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and it's just amazing how really pervasive this has been over time. Even when it's not around, it still kind of has that pervasiveness. Again, 14 years since when's the last time a Freddy movie with Robert Englund was 2003. That's Freddy vs. Jason. That's the last time Robert Englund was as Freddy in the movies.
Yeah. I
Still
mean, that's
talked about, still pervasive in today's world. Still, you mentioned
well,
Freddy Krueger, you know who he is, and like it's iconic.
yeah. And it's so funny because, as it turns out, Freddy versus Jason also arguably ended up being the last Friday the 13th film, like
Mhm.
of the original canon, basically.
Right.
And that movie is such a weird final note in the capacity of it ended both franchises when it really arguably should have stratosphere
Exploded them.
pushed them
Yeah.
farther.
Most successful, I
Um,
think, at that point for both of them, I believe, at that point.
it was. And like weirdly, I'll still always be a little weirded out. And now, granted, I know that the road to even get that movie made was a nightmare, obviously, and like pun fully intended at that point.
Yeah.
But I mean, enough that we did chase sequels to the point we got a actual like comic sequel, the one based on the treatment for Ash versus, Freddy versus Jason versus Ash, which was the crossover with the Evil Dead franchise. Because, obviously, Jason Goes to Hell, as we talked about, like teases that it's clearly the same universe. The Necronomicon is in it. Like it's part of
Right.
what brings Jason back. It's a whole thing. So they finally do it. But like, I think that part of it too became that I think you're right. Like once they kind of lost track of ever making that sequel and then they went, well, screw it, everyone else is rebooting. And so they redid their own version of it. It didn't work. And I think they got gun shy because then every other franchise that did that started going back to basics. And it was like Halloween went running back to Jamie Lee Curtis, right? And
Yeah.
was like, we need to bring her back. Like, let's do our own sequels, basically, pretending nothing else ever happened. You look at Evil Dead, they did an entire TV show where they went back to Ash because even Evil Dead 2013, like it did well. It actually did very well, but they just never made a sequel to it.
Right. Absolutely.
And so all these franchises started going back to their original parts, as it were. And I think that they looked at it and they looked at Robert's age and they went, oh no, we can't do that. And I wonder if animation would have been the right move. And, I know we're talking about all this because it all comes down to this original movie. And I would have been so curious to see, like, honestly, I would have liked to see a sequel to this movie and 3 that
Yeah.
was done this kind of similar to Halloween 2017 or
Yeah.
2018, I mean, where you kind
2018.
of just pretend that the rest of it never happened and you just kind of follow it up and you just make it a thing where it's like you pick up and you go, whatever happened to Nancy?
Right.
Where do we go with that? And I would have been interested to see because I think that Nancy Thompson, arguably, who we barely talked about to this point because
So
we were
far,
having
yeah.
fun talking about everything else. But Heather Langenkamp is arguably the reason that this movie works as well as it does outside of Robert Englund because Nancy Thompson is such a sympathetic character also. You already care about Tina, but they do such a great job also of building up Nancy and her like very rough home life. Clearly, like her mother and father don't get along. Mother is clearly drugging
Alcoholic.
herself and drinking and she doesn't really know what to do with it. Like that. The father is overprotective to the point that he's also not listening to her. He is always right. She's always wrong. There's nothing she can do about it. She's a great character.
I
And
agree.
she very much becomes a big part of the third film, as we will talk about soon enough. But in that capacity, you look at all that and you go, why did we never get one more? Because
Yeah.
that is the kind of character that would have been worth revisiting.
Yeah, I gotta say, like, I mean, I know we gotta point it out that she technically dies at the end of 3, but that doesn't stop anybody before, obviously.
No.
And what happened was one of the in part 4, which we'll talk about soon, also as well, is that they made that. s- I always think it's a dumb decision. You have 3 people who survived Nightmare 3, and like all 3 of them get killed, like right in the towards the very beginning, like the first like 10, 15 minutes of Nightmare 4. So it's like, why are you wiping out your entire like? There's strength in that like idea of having people you can go back to. Friday the 13th could do a legacy sequel today and feature Amy Steele, could feature Tom,
Mhm.
with Tommy Jarvis. We could have, like there's always the girl Lars from New Blood, Tina rather, I
Yep.
should say. You could have all these characters come back and be like, that'd be interesting to see where they are now. Like, don't kill them off like that. That just doesn't make any sense to me. And
Well,
Friday
and
Nightmare 4 suffers for it, I think, a little bit.
I think so too, and it's funny because I'd also argue, like, you can also recast if you
Mhm.
have to, right?
Yeah,
Say what you will, obviously, about the sequel that they made of Texas Chainsaw Massacre a few years ago on Netflix, but it also did the, like, bring back the final girl thing,
yeah,
right? And they definitely lean on that because that builds a history that you don't really necessarily realize is there, and it works. It works very well, in fact. I don't hate that movie as
I
much
don't
as a
either.
lot of people do,
I don't either.
and I'm also not as beholden to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre as a lot of people, so that also plays a part in it. Um, but I kinda think that you build these characters for a reason,
Yeah,
right? And people like these characters for a reason, and I think that if it's not for how good Heather Langenkamp is in this, you don't have a successful film because you need someone that can go up against Robert Englund, and
right.
she's so good at being his equal that the movie shines because of it.
Yeah, she's it's hard to play the audience, which is pretty much what you ask the final girl to do. Like, if she is the vehicle for the audience to get into the movie, you are that kind of thing. You're seeing everything happen around you just like she is, and she's exhausted and she has that tension about her, but she fights back. She's not like a damsel in distress. She does everything she can to fight back any way she knows how to fight back. She does a damn good job of fighting back. I mean, Home Alone, nothing. She starts doing stuff at the end that's just it's a precursor to Home Alone where she starts saying all these booby
You're
traps and
so
stuff.
not wrong. It's so hysterical how much it becomes Home Alone, and I had that thought actually while I was watching it because I was like, "I never really realized just how Home Alone-y it becomes." Like, and
Yeah,
that's not a dig, that's a
no.
I I kind of dig when movies do that, and it's pre-Home Alone, but, I mean, even post-Home Alone world, like, the last Rambo movie does
Home
that, which
Stallone.
is so funny. Yeah, Home Stallone, or you look at The Equalizer, and
Yeah,
the whole 3rd act of The Equalizer, it's just Home Alone inside of Lowe's.
yeah.
Like, it's fantastic. Denzel for all the Oscars just for that performance. Um, I just love that she comes off as not the damsel in distress.
Yeah,
She's asking people to help her, but she's also very actively involved, being the one who's fighting Fred Krueger, the one who's like, I'm gonna pull this fucker out. You guys keep telling me I'm crazy. I have now named this person for you. I've told you exactly what he looks like. You all know who he is. You all think I'm crazy. I'm gonna pull him out,
yeah.
and I'm gonna prove to you that he is actually alive but dead. And I love that she's the one who does it. Like,
She's
it's
very
not
proactive.
anyone telling her to do it. She goes, "Fuck it. I pulled his hat out. If I can pull his hat out, I can pull his whole ass body out of this dream."
Exactly. It's not she doesn't count on Johnny Depp to save her. She counts on Johnny Depp to help her. Of course, Johnny
Right.
Depp fails, but and she
Yeah,
does it.
because
She
he
does a good
falls
job.
asleep.
Because he falls asleep. Speaking of Johnny Depp, what a great character turn he is. Like this is a he shines in this movie in a smaller role. It's obviously his first role, his big debut, but you can tell right away that he's got it. He's got that charisma in there. Like he has like some lines in there like morality sucks. And it's just like these like humorous like, stabs that show you a personality beyond just a bit character in a horror movie. And it's a really good vehicle for him to explode from there.
100%. I hate to be the bearer of bad, sad breaking news, but Terry Garr passed away. Young Frankenstein and Tootsie's
Oh,
Terry Garr has passed away. I am sorry to say that it just broke. She was 79.
oh wow.
Our condolences go out to her family. Terry Garr, man, what a staple.
Right, yeah, that staple is the best word for it, man. She's been
Yeah, iconic, man. She was awesome. I friggin' love her in Tootsie. And of course, Young
yeah,
Frankenstein is like Young Frankenstein. It's
right.
one of those movies that you could watch forever. Close Encounters, like, you know, she's made so many movies, but just what a bummer.
Yeah, I mean, I loved her in all of. I mean, in MASH, the Bob Newhart show. She was
Yeah,
on SNL a bunch of times. Yeah, she was definitely an iconic standby at this point. So it's sad. It's part of us. We're getting older. We're just getting older as we go. We're losing more and more people. It's just kind of sad.
no, it is.
Uh,
It's just so sad, and it's just a bummer, you know.
yeah. Oh well. Well, rest in peace, and our thoughts go out to your family. Of course, I'm gonna
Yeah,
watch Close Encounters for you. Tootsie will be another good one. Tootsie will be another good. Mr. Mom. That's another good one I like.
Mr. Oh
Remember?
God, Mr. Mom's so good.
Right.
Her and Michael Keaton, so
Right.
good.
So, uh, 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 all right.
Wow, bummer, man.
Yeah,
Sorry, not to. I just it happened to cross me, and I had to let you know.
absolutely. Breaking news.
That's such a
So,
bummer, man. Also, you gotta say, to pivot back to this, John Saxon is the top billed person in this movie, which is so
yeah,
funny to me.
yeah,
And I don't mean that as a dig. It's just so odd when you consider it. And I really like him in this movie. Um, his performance as Nancy's father, Don, is great because he feels like the authority figure who should be protecting her. And for all intents and purposes, he's trying, but he's doing such a bad job at it in refusing to listen. He is arguably one of the most frustrating characters that you can encounter in a movie. And I say that with the utmost regard to his performance because that makes so much of the movie,
yeah.
of him being so standoffish where he cares, but he may not care enough and he also cares too much. And like it's such a fine line and he delivers it with the performance.
Oh yeah, you can tell he's overwhelmed. He does not have a great family life. Obviously, they are not getting along. He's doing his best to protect his daughter. He makes some questionable decisions. He kind of conflates his uh, lieutenant role. I think he's lieutenant in the police force with his father role, trying to make both ends meet. But he does the best he can. He just is not. The role he plays is he's the one that can't really fully believe it because who could believe it? You know what I mean? It's like this one of the things. Like you're telling me, so this guy attacking you in your sleep, and he's gonna kill. It's a dream. It's a nightmare. Suck it up. It's a parrot. It's one of those can't believe your kids things that you grow up hating, but like it's a trope for a reason because it's kind of like you don't have any experience supernatural at this point. Like we believe it because we're in this fantasy world. We've seen fantasy movies like this. We know what's coming up, but like when you're in the real world, as he has to act like he's in, you understand why he's kind of like, just get some sleep, you'll be fine, you'll be fine. Um, but yeah, it is a very good performance. Of course, I always remember him from Enter the Dragons, my big John Saxon love at that
Oh
point.
yeah.
But no, he does a good
He,
job here.
he's very good in it. And again, we gotta say one of the things about this movie that goes such a long way to your point is the like just go to sleep, but you can't. And
Right.
I love that as a concept because it's just so sleep is such a great thing, and yet we all know what it feels like when you don't sleep, right? And we've all gone through that. Like that feeling of how surreal it becomes, how exhausted you feel. And this movie is telling you you cannot sleep. You can't. You literally cannot because this dude will kill you if you go to bed. And that what does that do to someone?
Right. Sleep it rejuvenates you. It is an escape. When you're depressed, you go to sleep to try to you recharge that way. And you're telling me that that's a coping mechanism for like 3 or 4 different things, and you can't do that.
Yeah.
That's what you have to avoid. Man, like that's terrifying. That's terrifying. I close my eyes and I can see the killer in my eyes. Like that's just terrifying.
I think that's why Halloween and Nightmare end up continuing to be what I would argue are the scariest horror movies of their time and their eras, because there's something really like creepy and surreal. One about the idea of you can't sleep, all this is happening in your dreams. Like if you go to bed, you die.
Right.
And there's something so terrifying about that. But Halloween, on the other hand, it is just a random dude who
Yeah.
shows up in this town and starts stalking and killing people. Just no rhyme or reason, just a dude who gets out of a mental institution. Now, granted, of course, as the movies go, we learn more, but like as far as the original is concerned, that is what it is. And I think that makes it so terrifying because you're just babysitters at home
Yeah.
on Halloween and what happens in that. And so Nightmare really has something going for itself in being this idea that all this happens if you go to sleep. You need to stay awake. And it's so funny because I texted you during it. There's a line in the movie that talks about the idea of can't you give me a drug to just keep me awake? I don't want to sleep. And it's funny how much so many of the sequels lean on that later.
Yeah. That's what some of the best writers do when you listen to like horror movies specifically always tend to have for like legacy sequels or for just sequels down the line. You start getting fans of the original or fans of people who
Yes.
are, and they like that's the kind of thing they do. They dial into a line, and go, "Oh, that's interesting. We can make that a plot point now," and it becomes this great plot point. Obviously, the great plot point for 3, and then becomes a big deal in Freddy vs. Jason again as well. So it's
Right.
a great connectivity there. I love that.
It's so good. It's just smart writing, right?
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
think that arguably, you know, Wes had the right idea when he came back to write the third one. And again, we'll get into that obviously when we get to it. But since he wrote the third movie and that's when it becomes a thing, it's like, oh, the people who were involved in this get where like the obvious next part of this has to go.
Mm.
And I think that's like arguably and ultimately why A Nightmare on Elm Street though continues to persevere because that movie doesn't give you an easy out about just staying awake. There's no way to really do that at that point. And so this movie lives and breathes and dies on the fact that the only way to survive is to try to take away his power because everything else it doesn't matter. And if he gets out in the real world, he's still arguably going to be able to kill you.
100%. And what I love about the idea of this too, again, we go back to the vagueness, and vagueness can be a bad thing, but in some ways, vagueness can be an awesome thing as well. There is so much material you could dive into for like lore building as far as that goes for a dream demon. They touch on things here and there, like they talk about these like they have philosophy books, and they mention the dream warrior kind of situation, turning your back on dreams and stuff. And like, it makes me just think about how open area like this franchise could go if they wanted to. They don't tend to
Mhm.
do it. They tend to stick to more of the formula, and that's fine. I think it might be a missed opportunity, but maybe that might be a way to travel into it in the future. If somebody actually does buy the property, you could totally go into a different kind of situation and really explore that dream demon kind of stuff as they do. I mean, Wes Craven's New Nightmare does a little bit more too, obviously, when it gets into that situation. But it's a phenomenally deep, open well of possibilities there.
It's the one thing that I thought that Freddy versus Jason versus Ash did a lot of fun with was
Yeah.
actually playing with the, like, dream world a little bit more and the idea of, like, how can we manipulate that and have what if it moved more into our realm of reality on top of it? Like, there was a lot of really good ideas
Yeah.
within that I thought really worked,
Yeah.
and it made it really fun, honestly.
I read both
So
those recently, and so I was actually very happy with those. And like you said, like they bring back a lot of the final people as well. So it's good to see those.
mhm,
It does a great job of being connecting everything. And like we mentioned when we watched Freddy vs. Jason, what a good job that did. Considering that continuity is always a scary thing for Friday the 13th Nightmare. Those kind of they don't like it's not always a big thing.
yeah.
But Friday vs. Jason tried to connect it all in a way that made sense and didn't blow anything out of the water. And that I loved it for it. I think that's why we like Friday vs. Jason so much because it brings you together. Just like those comics are the same type of thing. So
Yeah, and I think you're right. It also because it's the second one really leans in on bringing back a lot of the legacy characters,
yeah,
and I think that ultimately, like that second one, really gets it. In that regard, I actually think Freddy versus Jason versus Ash would have made an amazing movie regardless. But like
yeah,
the sequel to it that they did as a comic as well really leans in on, well, what would we do now if we could bring all these characters back? And like, what would we do with it? And you can really do something interesting and special in that regard. And again, it's just so funny because it all just kind of comes back to this.
yeah.
And, like that comic obviously doesn't happen unless this is super popular and does well. And I still, to this day, cannot believe that like you look at it look at what this movie that very singularly tells its story, like there's nowhere for it to really go after the fact, like it really is singularly what it is, and it became a cultural icon to the point that it is crossed into television. It has gone into comic books. It has had a versus movie. It has had versus comics. Like, Nightmare became an institution off of this one film.
Yeah.
And I think also a lot of that has to go to what we were talking about earlier, a lot of the imagery. Like, how much of this movie has stayed with you since the first time you saw it?
So much. I mean, and I don't even realize it until I see some of them again. But like even watching, like you watch horror documentaries and you'll see them flash back to different things. Another image I forgot that I think is very iconic. Nancy in the bathtub and the glove coming
Mhm,
up between her legs, kind
mhm.
of like iconic imagery. And this film, you mentioned like Freddy versus Jason and everything else. I love me some Jason. I love me Friday the 13th, but like couldn't be successful without Robert Englund's Freddy. Robert Englund's Freddy carries the movie. And
Yeah,
really makes it work. And it's all built from this original film. Yes, he gets a little more wisecracky along the years. Yes, he gets a little more into the comedy aspects of things, and that's very evident in Freddy vs. Jason. But he's
yep.
always got that, always something behind it, and it's that darkness and deepness behind it that really kind of make you terrified of him.
No, 100%, and I think that it really shows just how much care they put into this movie in particular, that it continues to be such a standout, because here we are, like, this is its 40th anniversary year. Obviously, it's 2024. It came out back in 1984. It's 40 years old, and I'd argue that for 40 years, this movie continues to terrify audiences. It continues to be a gateway film for a lot of film nerds. It continues to be a gateway film for a lot of horror fans. Like, there's a reason that we still talk about it. It's the performances, it's the iconography of how it looks, it's the score, it's the cinematography. This
Ah,
movie is chock full of everything. And again, Wes builds so much tension just in how he puts it together and lets the movie just kind of be. It's a vibe film. It's not about having the world's best story. It's about creating tension where there needs to be tension and just letting it overwhelm you. Letting every sequence where Nancy is awake, but maybe she's not, like, creating that subversion of you think everything is reality until it's not reality. Like, the scenes in the school are some of the best stuff, where you see Lin Shaye walking around talking to the students, and you very clearly see Nancy is awake. Nancy is awake. She's nodding off, but she's awake. Only
still
for her
getting
to
that.
look over and you see someone in a body bag and you realize that, oh my God, she's fallen asleep. But
Right.
the entire time you think she's still awake because the movie is telling you with your eyes that she is still awake.
Right. And then there's like those little clues like, oh wait, maybe she like, oh, what's that? And they flash the kid who's reading the poem, and the kid's like reading it so monotone and like
Yeah.
even it's like, oh, okay, cool. And then she runs after her, she runs into that girl who's wearing the Freddy sweater and turn around and she sees him with the Freddy. It's like, okay, by that point, she's in full on dream, but it's like you don't know when the flip is, and that's what's scary because she doesn't either. And she doesn't know. Am I awake? Am I asleep? Oh, I'm definitely asleep now at this point. I love the fact that you keep mentioning a vibe movie, and the transitions in this film are very. I don't. If I say choppy, it seems like the bad thing, but I don't mean it that way because it hits the highlights of the story because it's not a story driven film like you said. We have these films like there's scenes and then we kind of like cut and we kind of go down, we go up, go down, but we're hitting the highlights of the story in a way because we don't need a driven story. We have the vibe, we have the points that we need to see, and it works in a way that sometimes I could see it not working in other films. You know what I mean?
Yeah. 100%. And again, like, as we talked about, this is not the first film to do like surreal dream-like stuff.
No,
Obviously, the Phantasm films were well into doing this to this point, and Don Coscarelli really leaned in on it. And again, it's so clear that Wes also has a little bit of reverence for it, because
yeah,
they even do, like, the end of Phantasm very famously is he goes upstairs, he goes into his room, and then the tall man comes through the glass and grabs him. There's
mhm,
a scene exactly like that in this one where Fred comes out of the mirror and grabs Nancy. Like, they do a bunch of stuff that is straight up homage to it, but Wes also finds a way to put his own spin on it, because once the dream world and stuff starts taking over, he really leans on the surrealism of it. And I've really, really always respected that. And I like that once Fred is out of the dream in the third act, one of the things I really like is that some of his nature kind of feels still out in the public. Like, yeah, he's out, or out in the real world, not the
right,
public, but
right,
you can feel like he still wants the power. He still wants to feel like he can. And I kind of like that there's flashes of like, oh, maybe my dream powers might work here, but maybe they don't. Like, I'm still also affected by the stuff that's happening right now. And he doesn't really know how to handle that. And I love that.
Yeah, me too. Because like it becomes a clear case of, oh, I'm in the real world. My power is diminished. I don't have the same level of power that I do, and it becomes
Yeah.
a great point of presence in Freddy vs. Jason. Obviously, much later on, that's the famous sequence where she brings him out, and then Jason's there, and he's like, ah, fuck. It's one of my favorite moments in that movie as well. I think we talked about that one. But yeah, Robert Englund plays it very well. It's one of the few times you see a hesitant Freddy Krueger to a degree, like not quite all there. Like he's making his threats, he's still going after, but he's still kind of like, oh, what's this? Oh, I'm getting hit with a freaking sledgehammer. Oh, the light bulb's exploding. Oh, what the hell is going on here?
Yeah. Again, I think that I would argue that so much of why this movie works is the setup. It's the stuff that the way it's written, the way that Wes puts it all together as a director, the way that the cinematographer put everything together. Like, you have to look at all this stuff and really, you got to be impressed, honestly. Like, you really do. And it just, everything about this movie comes together in a way that I think is so rare. People don't realize how hard it is to make a thing. Like,
Right.
it is, we can sit here and armchair Imagineer all the time about things we'd like to do. Look, I would love to get a Friday the 13th film, but I also have to remember, like, it's not as easy as it sounds.
No,
It's
no,
not. And for a movie to come together and be this iconic, where everything feels like it's firing on all cylinders, every one of the actors really shines and shows up. Like, this movie introduces Johnny Depp to the world, for better or worse, depending on who you talk to it these days. But like,
right.
this movie helped throw him into the stratosphere when he ended up in Jump Street,
Yeah.
right? So this movie is the beginning of that. It really reminded people who Wes Craven was. It put an entire new iconic villain into the world that would be franchised forever after this. Like, this movie is so important, and this
Mhm.
movie is so well made that it feels like a miracle. And I say that again as someone who's like, I do not love this franchise like a lot of people, and that's
Right.
not a dig at it. It just wasn't the one that I grew up watching. I admire it, but I especially admire this film because this film matters.
Absolutely. Not only does it matter, I don't know if people understand just how big Freddy Krueger got after this film. Like,
Yeah,
he was everywhere.
everywhere.
Like, he was on talk shows in character. He had lunch boxes. Kid, like they were marketing it as a kid. This is not a kid movie. This is in no way, shape, or form a kid movie at all. But they would market him everywhere. People would have the glove for Halloween. They'd have the Freddy hat or the masks. I mean, Freddy was huge. There was a time where I would say, honestly, might have been a small amount of time. Freddy Krueger might have been the biggest thing in the U.S. I mean, just the biggest thing, pop culture wise. Like, I don't know how many other horror villains can say that. I mean, Michael and Jason were both very iconic. But I kind of feel Freddy, like the height of
Mm,
Freddy's popularity, I don't know if there was any higher. I honestly don't.
I think Jason's up there because we also have to remember he also did Arsenio Hall
Hmm?
and stuff like that. So I would argue Jason got up there in the same capacity, but I don't think you're also wrong that Freddy is like he's an outlier. And you're
Right.
right, he is absolutely an outlier, and I think that's what makes it so special. And I think again because it was the character, right? Had Chucky, right, been a bigger thing that you could have put the doll on a talk show in some capacity and
Right.
had that, you could have argued that. And I would also argue, yeah, Chucky also became big, but not like this because again, Chucky also dissipated for a bit. Like after
Right.
Child's Play 3, the
Gone for a
franchise
while.
sat on ice for almost a decade.
Yeah, absolutely. At its height, yeah, I guess and I agree. Jason definitely was up there iconic wise, but I think Jason hurts. If you want to compare the two, the only thing Jason hurts is because it's hard to have him be such a character because he's not a character. He's like a monster. He's a shape. He doesn't
Right.
have character. Freddy became like charismatic. You're rooting for Freddy
Oh,
Krueger because he's funny,
100%.
and that's
That I
why.
will never disagree with.
So,
I just think that with Jason, like, arguably him ending up on Arsenio Hall is part of what makes it so fun
yeah,
because it's such a like weird thing because you're right. He's not really a character. And yet here he is on a talk show.
Right.
And they really lean in on that. And I
Right.
think that that's the only other time that you can even argue that another horror character became that iconic. And
I
it's
agree.
funny because, again, I would say when you look at Halloween in 78, you look at how Nightmare by 84, you look at Jason finally showing up in the Friday films in the 80s, you have Chucky show up. The 80s was chock full of like creating icons. And then it really isn't until Jigsaw that we start getting like newer icons again, because it feels like so many of them fell by the ways. Like we really leaned in on the icons through the
Yeah.
90s,
Yeah.
you know?
People could
And
argue Ghostface, but I think that Ghostface
yeah,
kind of you take away from Ghostface because it's not the same character every time. It's somebody else's.
right,
The mask is, but it's not the character. That's not a character. So that's a disguise. That's like a mask.
right.
You talk about Batman. That's who wears the cowl. It's not. We're talking about Batman. We're talking about Bruce Wayne. No matter who wearing the cowl or whatever. I agree. I get the icon thing. I think Jigsaw is probably the closest thing we've gotten since then. I mean, you
And
had
now
a
art,
couple since then.
obviously.
Art's up there. Obviously, art is up there now for sure. I think
And
anybody else.
I can't really give Pennywise because Pennywise was iconic in the 90s.
Yeah,
Like people forget that Pennywise was Tim Curry first now, I think. Like
yeah, I agree.
I hate to say it that way, but there's a lot to be said about, yeah, like the new Pennywise is great, but honestly, the Tim Curry one is still iconic for a reason. And that was a TV movie, and Tim Curry is so good in it that it scared people on network television.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
like that does matter in the conversation. Pennywise is iconic, but I would argue that it's not because of the movies. I would argue it starts with Tim Curry's version and then the movies.
Well, I think a lot of that's what the best slasher things can do, or the best icons do. They usually come from something else to a degree. Like, honestly speaking, I think one of the reasons when you talk Freddy, Jason, and Michael, those three, Jason and Michael can get lumped in together because they're similar. They're similar, right? They're
Right.
just kind of like their shapes. They have
They're
the
dudes in
masks.
masks.
They're silent. That's the kind of thing where Freddy was something completely different. But I think you mentioned Chucky. I don't think Chucky exists without Freddy.
No,
I think
100,
Chucky
100%.
it's very much a riff on Freddy, just a dull version of it or whatever. I mean, I think he wears similar colors. I want to feel like there's some of that red in there as well. And the wisecracking build, Brad Dourif. I mean, that's another guy. I would love to have seen Brad Dourif get a shot at Nightmare. If you're going to alter the cast from back in the day, Brad Dourif as Freddy Krueger, absolutely could have torn it to where he was.
I think you give it to Devin Sawa now.
Yeah, Devin Sawa. Yeah, Devin Sawa would be great. I love Devin Sawa. I do love him.
Devin Sawa's the guy.
Yeah. But yeah, so I think that's what it comes down to. Like it's not ripping it off. It's just riffing on it, and that's always a great horror thing to do. You riff on what happened before, you expand on it from there, and that's how you get new
Well,
horror films.
and again, does Nightmare exist without Phantasm? Who's to say? Because it's very clear that Robert Englund, or not Robert Englund, but Wes Craven was like a fan.
Yeah,
Whether, it may not have been the only thing that made him want to do it, but he very clearly had seen Phantasm enough that he riffs off of it. And that, again,
100%.
that's not a bad thing. You pay homage to the things that came before. Tarantino's entire career has been built off of making homage of other people's work.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and Psycho is the granddaddy of all the scary movies at this point. That's where they all kind of come from to a degree. Halloween, definitely a little bit of a not rip off, a riff of that. The Halloween's a riff of Black Christmas as well. There's a lot going on in there that kind of goes through. Black Christmas, I think, is underrated. I think that gets kind of forgotten in today's world compared to
It does. You know how I know? Almost no one got Black Christmas when it came to my horror trivia last week. That was one of those that I had it as you put the Final Girl and you have to name the franchise that the Final Girl is from, and almost everyone missed Black Christmas. And I was like, interesting. There was a couple people who got it, but like,
no, I mean it had a remake
by their way. Yeah,
late 2010s, and it was a good remake. It was fine, but I remember rewatching the original last year or two for another podcast I was listening to, and I was surprised that I was amazed at how good it was. I was like, this is really fun, especially for the 70s.
That original is real good.
Really good. So,
what do you have left to talk about with Nightmare, my friend? Anything else to add?
A couple of little things. I do like the Nancy and Mom sequences that are kind of like they showcase where we are. Nancy's mom being an alcoholic. We have like the great sequence with her and the vodka where she breaks the vodka bottle. The dream sequence, the dream deprivation study, or the dream study sequence where it comes through and she brings the hat out. It's an iconic thing.
So good.
So good. And she's like all upset, like, what's going on? What's going on? That works. The very sequence where Nancy's mom tells her for the first time who Freddy Krueger is and has the glove, and you're like, oh shit, this is deep and dark. This is a dark suburb. Like, this is a very dark suburb. Tina's parents are not exactly the greatest. Her mom and stepfather.
And like, you know, you find so much of her mom's problems also come from the fact that they murdered this man. Like, it's so clear that all her substance abuse goes back to this like thing that they really could have just never done.
Right.
Like, if they hadn't murdered someone, maybe she wouldn't have substance abuse problems. But here we are, and it's like, it's such an interesting character
because they don't hit you over the head with it. They don't hit you over the head with it. It's all kind of like just vague there. Like you see who she is now. You kind of hear a vague story about what happened, but you kind of have to connect the two in your head. What's going on? Like, it's not like you're overtly out there. Oh, this happened. I don't know if they don't have flashback to it and go, oh, this is why I drank. It's kind of like they just see it and you're like, it's develops over time. We're like, oh, okay.
Well, and it also, and it explains her dad, right? Yeah. And why her dad is so like overprotective.
100%. It just fills everything out. And that's what great storytelling does. You don't need a great story, like plot, to have a great storytelling device, which this does. And characters can fill in that gap very well. And we start from the get-go. Tina's parents are a little off kilter. Obviously, the stepfather doesn't give a crap about her, and the mom's there, like, you know, whatever. I even love the sequence, the Johnny Depp going over and telling his mom he's at his cousin's house, and I use the tape.
Oh God, it's so good.
It's such an 80s thing. It's such an 80s thing. I thought that was such an 80s device. Like, watching them laugh, the scream starts going on. He's like, it's a crash outside. No, it's just
it's neighbors arguing and fighting. I don't know, Mom. Don't worry, I'll call the cops. It's fine.
He's like, I'll do that.
Oh, it's so good.
So good. So good. Last couple of things. I do have two more things here. Two things real quick. The Tina bedroom sequence obviously also had some great Freddy moments. One of my favorite bits is Tina's dream right before she gets killed. This is God. That moment with Freddy, this is God. So creepy. It's followed up by some of the most creepiest, weird, and like, if it was a scary movie, you'd almost laugh at it. But Freddy's run, his run, he's running like this.
It's actually really unnerving.
Yeah, exactly. It's like almost like a creepy body movement in a way. And
honestly,
Robert Englund.
Yeah, it is. And it's so funny because I feel like his entire introduction too, right? And I'm not talking like the opening where we see the glove and all of that, but I'm talking like when we first see him in the dream sequence and just the way that he's kind of shadowed and the way that we see him and like his arms kind of expanding out and then like being able to pop between spots and just that whole thing in the, hey, look, and he cuts his fingers off with the knives. Like, everything about the way he's creepy, like everything that should be kind of funny is actually really unnerving because he just is such a like evil presence.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like actually there's a moment in that whole sequence, which is, or not, I think it's the Nancy one, perhaps. Either way, is the moment in one of the dreams where it was straight out of like an Acme cartoon, but like there's a tree and all of a sudden Freddy like appears from behind the tree. Like he wasn't on the one side of it. He just kind of appeared behind it and comes out. And it's like a cartoon, but the way it does it, it works to be very creepy and very scary because it's just the way they've been handling everything the entire time. Robert Englund just blows my mind in this. Last thing I have, we didn't mention it too much. We didn't talk about it too much. We kind of hinted at it a few times. But the whole film is a lot about gaslighting Nancy.
I sent you that. I literally told you. I was like, it's kind of gaslighting the movie.
It is. It really is. Like Nancy is trying to do all these things and nobody will listen to her. Johnny Depp is like the most receptive, but basically it's just because he wants to get laid. It feels like everybody else is like, just forget it. The parents are hanging up on her. They're getting bars in the window, yada, yada, yada. My favorite bit of that though, and this is like a couple times it goes not too far is the wrong word, but like if this came out in today's world, the modern social media would tear it apart for some of these things. Like it would not be considered like a classic because it'd be like, oh, these people are stupid. This would never happen. In the 80s, you let a lot of that stuff go. That was part of the magic. He didn't really care. It's like, okay, we get it. One particular moment that stood out to me completely. Johnny Depp gets killed. His character gets killed. Nancy's on the phone, and her father shows up, and it's like she's dead, and she tells him the story. She's like, okay, I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna go in and get her. And I want you to be there to help me, Daddy. And he's like, yeah, sure, I'll be there. You do it. Just get some sleep. Good idea. And he's like, you're not listening to me at all. But he's gonna.
Nope.
So he's like,
Well,
gets to the point where he goes up to his like the sergeant, whoever they're cops.
his like lieutenant sergeant guy. Yeah.
He's like, all right. He's like, you know what? He's like, all right. Look, just basically, my daughter's crazy. Let me know if anything you see anything or hear anything. Like, just kind of like let it go. And he's like, all right. So he goes inside to do his. It comes out. She comes out of the dream, gets Freddy out. She starts like yelling out for her father. She breaks the window. And he's like, get my father. He's like, oh, and the guy's like, it's gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay. He's like, get my father, you asshole. Like, it takes like 10 minutes. And the guy's finally like, huh.
I wonder if I should get her dad. He might be the dumbest character of all time, and it's so funny because Dewey Cox is so, or not Dewey Cox, but Dewey from Scream is 100% based off that dude, of course, because he also directed that. But like, it's so very clear that whole character thing is based off of this guy. That this totally useless cop who sees her. And by the way, when she breaks the window, at one point, Freddy is in clear visibility of him if he's looking.
Running by him, yeah, absolutely. There's screams going on. You just had any, like, not for nothing, but say you don't believe the dream demon and stuff, whatever. Somebody just got murdered across the street, and as far as you're concerned, cop-wise, there's a killer loose.
Yeah.
And she's breaking the window going, help me. He's like, I wonder if I should get to lieutenant.
All the adults in this film are just useless. Just useless.
Useless, detrimental. Lin Shaye is the closest. And that's just because she lets her go home. That's about it.
She lets her go home. That's it. Go home.
Last thing I'll say, one more iconic. I keep shouting out all the iconic images that I keep remembering. Last one I'll do: Nancy running up the stairs and going through the stairs, the marshmallowy kind of substance or whatever. She breaks through the stairs while Freddy's chasing her. Another iconic sequence for me. I like that as well.
Dude, this movie again, it's just chock full of it, right? Like there really is just so much to love.
100%.
Just good stuff, man.
It's iconic, but
it's iconic.
There's no other word for it, really. It's an iconic film. Great entry into the franchise, into horror franchise.
91 minutes.
Yeah.
Remember what you can do in a movie like this with 91 minutes. And that's not a dig, because I do not subscribe to movies are too long nowadays. Like I don't believe that. I think that movies tend, to the most part, to be about what the length they need to be a lot of the time. I think some people get caught up. It's over 2 hours. They start thinking you can cut 20 minutes out of every movie around. And it's like, well, that's not really accurate. But I'm reminded, though, what you can do in 90 minutes. And this movie in particular really shines for being 91 minutes of just fun and terror.
Doesn't need more than that. Just, I have it on the background. I just watched the movie while we're talking about it. I forgot about the backup coffee maker.
Oh yeah.
She's got it ready. I love it.
God, this movie's just so good, man.
It kicks. It definitely kicks. All right, let's rate this son of a bitch on a scale of 1 to 11, because we always rate things on a scale of 1 to 11 here on PLD Projects. Turn it up to 11. What do you give the original Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984?
I mean, look, man, there's a reason that this franchise exists after this movie. It's not like Friday, where I'm actually a little surprised, right? Friday, somehow, no matter how many times I see the original, I'm always surprised we got more, because I feel like the original is just not on the same level as this and Halloween. This and Halloween really stand out being what they are. They really... a lot of horror franchises are honestly this way. You look at the original first film, and it stands above the rest in a lot of ways because there's a reason it became iconic. There's a reason people love it. There's a reason that we continue to go back to it. There's a reason 40 years later we're still celebrating it. It came out on 4K this year for its 40th anniversary. The movie has never looked better, by the way. I watched that 4K transfer of it. This movie's never looked this good. It's one of Wes Craven's best movies. Uh, Incredible performances across the board. It gave us an iconic villain. Is there any other world where I can't just give it a perfect 11? I mean, that's what this movie is. It is. It is a perfect encapsulation of why we love movies. This movie rules. Incredible performances. It's vibes the movie. We stand 11 out
I
of 11.
I 100% agree. There's no surprise to anybody here that I'm also giving it a perfect 11. It's like I said, one of my favorite, probably my favorite horror movie when I was a kid. I think I subscribe to being Halloween now is probably my favorite overall as I've matured a little bit. But Nightmare is the one that really got me into horror. And you mentioned specifically like Friday or Nightmare and Halloween specifically because there's a lot of horror movies in the 80s and a lot of similar type of horror movies, and
Oh,
we
yeah.
love them, and we love bad horror films, love good horror films and everything. I think Halloween and Nightmare really stand out because they are great, iconic filmmakers. They're really good filmmakers making a horror movie, and
Yes.
when you have a great director and a great storyteller, you put them in a genre like this, which is known for having a lot of schlock, you can still get great movies. So horror is great, and when horror is phenomenal, because like these two guys directing it, it's amazing.
It's
It
just
is,
another level.
yeah, absolutely.
It just
Um,
is, and that's why we go back to it. Again, you have an iconic performance in Robert Englund as well. Like,
yeah,
this movie, Heather Langenkamp, incredible. Like, you can throw a dart at everyone in this movie, and you could pretty much guarantee that you're gonna hit a great performance on top of it. Like, that's what makes it special. It's not just that it's iconic because I mean, look, how many of the scenes do we talk about where the imagery alone sold it or whatever? But the fact that the performances are that good on top of it, the fact that Wes Craven is firing as hard as he is as a filmmaker, like the editing in this film is remarkable. Is it real? Is it not? Everything about this movie is just that movie, man.
and I know it's the 80s. I know it was it's like 40 years ago. I get that, but even so, on a budget of $1.8 million,
Yeah.
the whole thing, like
Yeah.
you don't need money if you do things right. You need a lot of money
Mhm.
to just do it this way. So there you go, guys. That will do it for us. We were finished with the original Nightmare on Elm Street, one of the most iconic movies of all time. I'm very happy we got to do this one, and we will be here next time. For I am very interested to rewatch Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2 for a lot of reasons. I know the director actually didn't like the original movie. And so they, for some reason, New Line hired somebody who didn't like the original movie, and they made like something reactionary to it. It's completely different. It's completely balls to the wall. And at the same time, I also know I don't want to overthrow the word iconic, but there's a classicness to it. As far as like gay cinema loves this movie.
Yeah,
It is
it is
that.
funny. I recently revisited it before this. I think it was last year. It was part of the Streamerama down
Mm,
here, and it's so funny how this movie, which I actually back when I was growing up, I didn't love it. I've come around on it a lot, but it's amazing how much, to your point, it's been taken over in
wow.
like a good way, and like people have
Celebrated.
really celebrated it. Yeah, taken over was not the right word, but like it's really been celebrated and like just collected by
Right.
a totally different group. I think that people would not have thought about it coming
Right.
out of.
Right. Absolutely, and I'm happy for them for that. I
Yeah.
know I'm not gonna I haven't watched it in a bit. I know I'm gonna come back saying this is not my favorite, and it won't be my favorite, but I do have a healthy respect for it, and I'm happy it exists, for an audience who loves it. So it's one of those things. I'm very interested to see where I fall on it this time, before I go back to Wes Craven and, part 3, which is very iconic. And I'll say here's a spoiler alert for there. When we get to that episode, I'll mention one thing. The Indiana Jones franchise for me. It's like the Raiders and Last Crusade thing.
Yeah.
One might be the better film. 3 might be my favorite. I don't know. We'll have to see. But a lot,
Yeah,
lots,
for
lots
sure.
in this franchise. So, all right, PJ, where can the folks find you?
You guys know where to find me in all the places where social medias can be found. You can find me at PJ Campbell. You can find me hanging out here, doing my thing, talking movies with this gentleman beside me. Well, not physically beside me, but close enough. And just doing the thing, man. Get out and vote. That's it. Like, we're in the last week of the election. Get out and vote like your life depends on it. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but get out and vote. Like, do your thing, man. We're lucky we get to be in a world where, in a country where we can even do that. Don't waste your vote. Just go and vote, please.
Yeah.
That's all I ask. Go vote.
Exercise your right. Exercise your right
Yeah.
for sure.
Use your voice.
Use your voice. You can find me at Paul_Denuzio on Twitter and social stuff. You can find me all over this channel, obviously, with the name on the tin. I got Star Wars podcast I do every week with Matty Gunner, Holy Snokes. I got this great podcast with PJ Campbell every other week. Every other week, I do a review with Lego. I mentioned that before. We talk about V. And I do my Queen podcast every week as well. It's a lot of fun. We have a lot of fun here. And I have patreon.com/PLD Projects if you want to go even further in supporting us. I get it. If you can't, I understand that. But we got a great crew, Austin Goodell, Brian Buckingham. We have a fun chat, and I try to do some extra content or like some early release content, so to speak. But if you can't, I get it. You can help me out by subscribing, liking, commenting, help us fight the almighty evil algorithm that there is out there. And yeah, we'll be back next week for more Freddy, or next 2 weeks from now, Freddy Krueger talk. Yeah, I can't wait for it. And until then, of course, sleep easy, guys.
Peace, bitches.